and just to make sure that everything is connected on Dr. and Oliver's end. So we will be starting properly at 6 o'clock, but just wanted to make sure, again, everything, you can all can hear us well, you all can see us. So we will be starting again at 6 o'clock. Thank you. Oh, well, so I'm looking. So this is the first time I've done it, and it has the, sorry, is the one on? Let me see, did it do anything yet? Okay. Okay, perfect. So it does say that it's streaming on
Nice.
on all the different platforms. Yep, I just got the message. Join now. Strategic question.
Okay.
And then just now on YouTube. Okay, so we know it's working.
Well, that seemed to be a very seamless process.
Yeah, well, and that was, you know, you do all this planning for you. Like, I hope the technology actually works out. So yes, I'm happy that it's working well. And then especially if it's something that you eventually start doing your thing, you at least, I mean, this will be something you could use, because it, like I shared, it got like 30 different platforms.
Right.
Some of which I haven't even heard of before.
Oh gosh. Okay.
And I did just edit your name and put doctor in front of it too.
Okay. Well, thank you. Well, I guess before we officially start, thank you for this opportunity. I should have said that first.
Oh no! For one, it's a pleasure. Seriously, I even knew, like, even from connecting with the Lincoln group,
Mm-hmm.
I was like, and just again, even though when you connect with people who are actually practitioners,
Yeah,
opposed to theorizing
right.
about stuff that may or may not even happen, or so.
Yeah, I think that's what I really enjoy about what I do, is being able to take the theory and put it into practice.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, like, see, like, oh, this is what we learned about. Okay, I get it.
Right.
It makes a big difference.
And are you connected at all with professors from your PhD program?
Professors
Yeah, some of, like, your professors, do you still communicate or talk to some?
absolutely. Hmm. Yeah, we still write. Not as often as I'd like, but yeah, we still try to push some articles out.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's just a matter of finding the time. That's all.
Right. Right. So we do see people getting on. Thank you all for getting on. We'll be getting started at 6 o'clock. Dr. Oliver and I just having a brief conversation before we get started, but we will be getting started promptly at 6 p.m. Do you kind of stack your days so it's more research heavy on one, where you're doing more interviews and focus groups, or do you kind of spread them throughout the day?
It depends. It depends on what projects I have. So sometimes it also depends on stakeholders too, right? So it'll depend on when they want data back. So if it's a typical timeline of a couple of weeks, I may spread it out, especially if the interviews are an hour. But if it's a quick turnaround, or if I'm doing usability testing in addition to interviews, I try to just crank them out.
Right.
So just try to get them all done in one day and turn it around and get it back to my stakeholders in time.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm seeing 6 o'clock. Are you seeing 6 o'clock as well, Dr.
Sure am.
Oliver?
Yes, let's do it.
Okay, so first off, thank you all for joining Dr. Oliver and I as we discuss strategic questioning, having a deeper dive into customer interviews and focus groups. And this particular topic is something that is of particular interest to not only both of us with the work that we're currently doing, her with Lucian and myself overseeing the Locus Group, to where we are a customized research organization. We can come in at any step within the research process and work with either qualitative research, focus groups, interviews, a lot of which we will be discussing tonight, as well as quantitative research, predictive analytics, statistical analysis, forecasting. And we do this in a mixed methods capacity, with primarily working with higher education institutions. And a lot of the work we're doing with them is quantifying particular experiences to then see how it impacts particular success metrics on their 5-year fluctuating average. And some of the other work we do is jury outcome prediction. And just as a quick example, one of the cases and things that we'll do, we had one particular case to where there was a Black kid who was hit by a car, and the attorneys thought that the case value may have been too low. We then took those case facts and changed just one particular variable in the cases that we tested, which was the race. For one of the cases, we changed the name to sound more of an Asian sounding name, and the other one to sound more like a Jewish sounding name. Well, what we saw was the case values tripled and quadrupled. We were then able to then look at particular analysis of what was contributing to those higher case values and incorporate them into the case for the African-American kid who was hit. So that's just a brief example of some of the work that we do. So over the course, if you have questions as Dr. Oliver and I are talking, please don't hesitate to let us know. And if you see any ways in which you would like to collaborate, we would absolutely love to. So Dr. Oliver, for one, again, thanks for joining us. Thanks for joining us to talk about strategic questioning. And if you don't mind, just sharing a little bit about your background, either your upbringing, your experiences, and some of the work that you are doing right now.
Sure. Well, again, thank you, Dr. Locus, for inviting me, and I'm very happy to be here and excited to share. So just a little bit about myself. I am originally from New York, and my background was really in engineering. So I have a civil engineering degree, but then I went back for graduate school, and I just had this heavy interest in research. So I went to Central Michigan University and received my PhD from there. And so I started out as a professor. So I was in the academy just doing, research methods, statistics. Those are my loves. And then I had an opportunity to work for a product development company and come back to Michigan. And so I started there. We were really interacting with physical products. And this is where I really learned about usability, right? So it's like, okay, it's the fit, it's the form, it's the function. So I might have a beautiful object, but if I can't use it, it doesn't serve a purpose. So I really learned more about, okay, this is an actual field, but I could use my skills in research methods and statistics and data, management and data analysis, and do this every day. I then moved to Lucian, where I am now. I'm a principal UX researcher. So I lead projects that really deal with that digital space, which I love software. So it's a perfect fit. So every day I get to talk to people about their issues, like their pain points, what works for them, what doesn't work for them, in order to improve our products.
Absolutely. And Dr. Oliver, if you don't mind me asking, what was your PhD in? What was your particular area of expertise, if you don't mind?
It's applied experimental psychology. Okay. And I was in the psychophysiological lab. So
got it. Okay. So a direct correlation to the work you are doing as a UX principal researcher.
Yes, absolutely.
Great. So we wanted then, before we get into the foundation of strategic questioning, if you could maybe just provide like an overview of what focus groups are, what interviews are, and if there are any basic rules of engagement that we should be looking at, whether it's how many people should be in one, are there a particular amount of variables we should be questioning? How many questions should they be? So before we get really down into strategic questioning, could you please give us a brief overview of some of the rules of engagement with focus groups and interviews?
Okay, sure. So focus groups should have between 6 and 12 people, typically. You want it to be large enough to be representative, as much as you can, of your target group, and also getting diverse perspectives. So you have to think about, do you have like age representation, race representation, experience representation on a particular product, right? And then you don't want it to be too large, because then you might have issues with like group dynamics and discussion. So there's a balance there. Interviews are typically one-on-one, so that would be the difference there. So I'll talk a little bit more about like the mechanics of the focus group, right? So in terms of questioning, this is pretty tricky because you don't want to have more than like 10 key questions. I would say even 8, depending on the size of the group, because you want to have enough time to explore and probe and have meaningful responses. You also have to be careful that you're not rushing through the sessions. So if you can hit that sweet spot of perhaps 8 versus having a whole bunch that you can't get through and you're feeling like you're rushing through. You asked about variables as well. I would say a limited number of variables, because too many can lead to these scattered insights and you're not going to be able to focus, right? Hence the focus group title. So if you're going to conduct one, then you'll want to prioritize like those critical variables and then explore those thoroughly. If you feel that you have too many, then just do a separate focus group. That would be my recommendation there. Okay, so interviews. You want me to get into that the same way? Okay, so it's again a little bit different than focus groups because they're one-on-one. So it's best to strike this balance between like gathering information that you need, as well as engaging your participant and like having these in-depth discussions. So you'll want to think about how many open-ended questions are you going to have. You don't want to do too many, because then you really want those thoughtful responses and you don't want to exhaust the people that you're interacting with. The time availability. So is it going to be 30 minutes? Is it going to be 60 minutes, right? And really thinking about what that would look like. And then how complex the topic is. So you'll have to balance all of those 3 while also maintaining engagement and, really being an active listener. So it's a much more heavy lift for the well, they're both heavy lifts for moderators, but it's different when it's one-on-one versus managing a group dynamic.
Right. And I think too, one of the things that that there's a reason why you are doing focus groups and interviews consistently, because just one focus group or one interview does not tell the whole story. There needs to be multiple, and as you take information and insights from particular focus groups and interviews, that then provides additional ways to ask particular questions in the future.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And another thing I'll mention too is, I know a lot of times there seems to be some confusion, but I know you would know that no matter how many people you have in a focus group, the N is still a 1. There's still an N of 1, especially because you have the statistical intact group problem. So being able for people to capture that just because there's a focus group of 12 people does not mean that the N is 12, the N is 21.
That's right.
So then as we then look at pivoting a little bit to strategic questioning, can we then talk about then the art of asking the right question, and what are the different either ways or choices of questions that we have to then get deeper depths and deeper insights?
So with the types of questions, so it's going to really depend on what you're trying to gain from the participants, right? So you'll use open-ended when you want like detailed, unrestricted responses. So you may not know what you're going to get, right? But you're going to get feelings, opinions, you'll get experiences. So anytime you want that deep understanding, that's when you'll want to use open-ended questions.
Mm.
I usually will use open-ended types of questions, whether it's, one-on-one or focus group, usability test, whatever, or at the earlier stages of research, right? So like exploration or discovery, and when I don't really have a specific hypothesis, I just
Mhm.
want to get information, right, and that I can build off of. So for example, like, how do you feel about our product, right? That's just,
Right.
it's very open-ended. And I may hear something that I might not want to hear or might not have expected, right? Or describe your experience with our product, right?
Mhm.
So I may get a host of responses, and I have to really think about what I want to ask next and how I want to follow up, right?
Right.
Close-ended is like, I want specific information. I want quantitative data, perhaps,
Mhm.
right? It's I usually use this in the later stages of research when I want to validate, something or quantify a certain finding. Um, if you really want to be strategic, since we're talking about strategic questioning, right? There's value in using a mixed method, right?
Mhm.
Because then you're not overwhelming your participants or your focus group participants with a whole bunch of open-ended questions.
Mhm.
So you can ask, these closed-ended, like, rate your experience from 1 to 5, and then follow up with, okay, tell me a little bit more.
Right.
Um, I typically would do that with studies, like I'll ask, how easy or difficult was it for you to do this task? And if they give me a 4, I can follow up and say, what would make this a 5? And then get
Mhm.
their feedback in that way.
Right. Right. Yeah. No, that's great. And as we're on that same line, can you then maybe share some strategies and some techniques
Mhm.
that promote thoughtful and meaningful responses?
Sure. So this is going to sound, I know people are going to say, well, what do you mean? So you don't want to go too broad,
Right.
right? So it's like, well, what do you mean too broad? So I know I use this as an example, but too broad would be like, what are your thoughts about our product? That's just a
Mm.
free for all, right? So you may get, I don't like it because it's blue. That's not going to really be helpful to me. So
Right.
I have to think about, well, can you share specific features about our product that you might find most valuable? That helps
Mhm.
narrow it down a little bit so that they're not going to tell me about they don't like the color blue. They're going
Right.
to tell me more about some other features that don't work for them because I'm thinking about functionality. Like,
Mhm.
can they use this product? That the color and all that stuff, that's not my area. So that's why I'm not going to really, I don't want to say I don't want to hear that, but that's not going to really give me what I need to make this product better for my user. That's ultimately what my job is. Um, I don't want to say, again, too broad. How do you feel about our customer service, right? Like,
Mhm.
can you tell me about a recent experience with our customer service department? That, again, helps narrow it down so
Right.
that you can be very strategic and intentional about what you want to get, the information that you want to get from your participants. Um, that said, don't be afraid to use open-ended questions because
Mhm.
that's what's going to give you what you are there for.
Right.
And also, try to build rapport with your user, right? You don't want to be too clinical where it
Mhm.
feels like you're doing just check boxes, and then you don't want to be overly familiar where you're trying to be their friend. That's not going to give you what you want either. And make sure that you're probing for detail. So if someone says something, I usually will think to myself, the so what question, right?
Mhm.
So like, okay, well, tell me more. So what does that mean to you? Like, I try to probe more to get more out. My philosophy is always like, if I have a warm body in front of me that's talking to me, I'm going to try to get as much as I can in that
Mhm.
hour or whatever time that I have with them. And then there are some pitfalls to avoid, right?
Yeah.
The leading questions, right?
Mm.
Do you agree that our product is the best on the market? Okay. If I'm a participant and I'm like, no, right? Like, that's gonna that's gonna have an effect, right? The other is the double barrel question. Oh gosh,
Mm.
do you find our program innovative and informative?
Mm.
I might find it innovative and maybe not informative. How do I answer that question? So
Right.
you have to be
Right.
really careful about those.
Yeah. Well, and then could you then maybe even, which I think you did, and you may want to share just a question or two that do encourage some of that openness and thoughtfulness.
Mhm. Yeah, I usually will say like, well, how, how would you describe your experience with something,
Yeah.
right? Or tell me about your overall experience or your levels of satisfaction, or from your perspective, what factors did you feel contributed to your success in completing this task? I'll
Hmm.
usually ask questions along those lines. Um, so just to give like an overview of what I typically will do in that discovery phase, I'm usually trying to find out what somebody is doing in their job and then what's not working, whether they're using our product or not. And it's usually they're not using our products, right? I'm just trying to find out what they do so that I can go back to my team and say, hey, there's an opportunity here to do this with our product so that we could, be a leader in this space and we can win in this space. So when I'm talking to users, I'll say like, okay, you are a system analyst, right? Tell me a little bit about your day-to-day work. So if you could create 5 buckets of what you do to describe to me what you do, what would that look like? And then they start thinking about what their day looks like. And then I could say, okay, so you said in this like second bucket, you do this. What is it about that really works well for you? Or tell me some of the tools that you use in order to do your work. So I'll say things like that in order to get them to think about their work
Hmm.
and their process. Because I don't know, I usually don't think about my process whenever I just come to work and I do what I do. But if
Right.
somebody were to ask me about my process, it makes me, shift my mindset a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for that, Dr. Oliver. And to then maybe even drill down just a little bit to focus on specific areas, higher education, business, entrepreneurship.
Hmm.
What are ways that you see higher education leaders, higher education institutions being able to utilize strategic questioning, especially with all the challenges that are ahead and that institutions are facing?
Right, absolutely. I would think it would be critical to use strategic questioning because there's so many diverse needs and expectations of all of these different stakeholders within the academic community, right? So you have students, right? So you may want to get student engagement, like how to create a more positive learning environment from students. So strategic questioning can help in that space. And so basically you're segmenting, right? So you're thinking about students, you can think about faculty, instructional designers, staff. So all of them can have separate sets of questions,
Mhm.
right? So faculty, like, what about the course content? Do you find that it's relevant? What about training, professional development opportunities? So that would be specific to that group. Staff, right? Like the effectiveness of your efficiency of the administration, perhaps, right? So you can, if you are a higher ed leader, you have to think about who are the segments that you want to target, right? And then craft specific questions for those groups because ultimately you'll get like more nuanced and actionable insights in order to make these like data driven decisions.
Yeah, yeah, and then as they start to then kind of get all this information, it allows for more advanced research like triangularization to be able to then see what are those insights and how is it collectively impacting groups of stakeholders. And if,
Absolutely.
and if we can do the same, if we can have that same question
Mhm.
for business and entrepreneurship, you're specifically working in business. So how do you use strategic questioning? And how can businesses, how can entrepreneurs use strategic questioning and specifically to the work that they're doing?
Okay, for sure. So, as I mentioned before, how I use it is typically when I'm interacting with participants, right? Actually, I'll sometimes use it when I'm interacting with my stakeholders to identify what their needs are, right?
Mhm.
Because I'm basically like the bridge between the two. So I'm trying to find out, okay, what are your needs? What do you need to know? And then I'm trying to get that information from my participants. So there's a lot of like critically thinking about what I want to ask
Mhm.
ahead of time. But if you're, an entrepreneur and you're in this space where you're like, okay, I know that my business evolves very quickly, right? So there are advancements in tech and there's changing consumer behaviors. What do I need to do? So you could explore like these market shifts, identifying market trends, understanding the competitor landscape. That's going to be really big. Understanding customer motivation. So that's where, like some of our research teams come in. What are some of the consumer preferences and unmet needs that are out there? How do you maintain high customer satisfaction levels? All of those things is very similar. Like, so you're still segmenting,
Right.
but it's a way to get a full picture of how to take actionable, like recommendations from the data and do something about it, especially quickly because
Right.
of the changing environment of business, for
Right.
sure.
And making that data actionable.
Absolutely. We talk about actionable recommendations all the time, right? So it's
Mhm.
not just good enough to say, this is not, we found this from these groups of people. They said this, here you go. It's like,
Mhm.
that's great, but what do we do about it? So you have to have some type of actionable recommendation based on the data.
Right. And especially since those actionable research, those actionable insights are coming from good questions and strategic questions.
Absolutely.
Um, can you then talk about, or even maybe even share some good questions or some examples of questions that then could then lead people into really uncovering those insights for their particular customer or stakeholder?
Sure. So I'll ask questions like, are there any aspects of our products that you find challenging or frustrating?
Mhm.
Right. And I know that people don't really want to hear like the negative, but I want to know what are your pain points so that I can just like make recommendations to improve it.
Mhm.
Right. So that's how I view my job. Right. But this encourages customers to share like their real world experiences. And then, you'll get insight into pain points, needs, motivations, expectations, all of those things. And I think that there's value in that. I think that the participant sees value in us asking those types of questions,
Right.
right? You can say something like, looking ahead, what features or improvements would you like to see in our products? Right. So
Mhm.
then you'll get like those expectations for the future. Then you can say, okay, now I'll know what to prioritize because I'm hearing users say this, right?
Yeah. I
Um,
really, I, and I really like that what you just said, because we've even done that sometimes, even asked particular questions in regard to how they think either in the past, present, and future, to then be able to then not only track, right, what
yes,
particular
yes,
demographics and groups are thinking about, but how it's shifting over time in relation to Census Bureau data and all these other things that impact it. So I really appreciated when you put that particular question on time to then understand
mm,
what people are thinking of and what their expectations are in the future.
that's right. Absolutely. I've asked, like, what's been your most memorable experience with our product?
Mm.
Right. So it's like, what actually resonates with them? So rather than say what resonates with you, right? I can
Right.
extract it by asking their memorable experience. It gets them thinking in that mindset. And then I'll do a fixed question, right? On a scale from 1 to 10, how
Mhm.
likely are you to recommend our product or service? This is the NPS, Net Promoter Score, which I'm sure a lot of folks are familiar with, right? But then
Mhm.
that's a gauge of customer loyalty,
Right.
right?
Right.
So those are those types of questions that I will typically ask.
Well, and I'll just share a brief example of like the Promoter Score. So when I was at Winona State overseeing the equity and inclusive excellence efforts, before we even changed the name to that, it was the Office of Inclusion and Diversity. And one
Mhm.
of the things that we did, we worked with one of the marketing professors, shout out to Dr. White, to then really understand the brand of the Inclusion and Diversity Office, because we just saw there just wasn't as many people coming to our event. So for his class, the first semester of the class was more of the market research, and then the second half of the class was a small business consultant. Well, they ended up doing the research to understand what our net promoter score was. So once they gave us the feedback, the first thing that the students said was, your net promoter score is worse than Spirit Airlines. And nothing against Spirit Airlines, but that was the main point that the students
Wow.
were actually focusing on. So we then did some things to then, of course, change the name and things like that. But that
Mhm.
net promoter score it's something that we were able to utilize, and I know organizations and companies utilize it all the time to then understand what that loyalty is.
Absolutely.
Great. And so then, even when we then transition to looking at the role, then you gave us some good examples of some questions that we could utilize. So then, where does the role of follow-up questions come in? When do we use follow-up questions, and how do we know when to be able to use them versus kind of continuing on a particular path of question?
So if you get a very surface level response, even in your open-ended question, you want to probe further. You'll want to do some type of follow-up questions, because those follow-up questions will uncover those nuances that you won't get from just the surface. So I'm trying to think of an example. I am just fortunate that the clients and the customers that I do talk with, they are very they're talkative, right? They'll tell me as much as I want to know.
Well, it's all higher education people, right?
Yeah. I mean, I do get some students as well. So I'm trying to think of like when I've interviewed and talked with students and some of the things that they've said. They might say something about registration is always a hassle, right? If I ask them about their experience with registration, if I just took that, because most of us know that, right? I remember my registration days were a nightmare, right? So I can certainly say like, oh, okay, they answered that question. It was open-ended, but I want to probe more and say like, okay, well, tell me a little bit more about that. Like, what happens in the beginning stage of registration? What happens in the middle stage or the end stage? Then I can find out exactly where that frustration occurs. It might be that they're trying to schedule all their classes and they have calendars all over the place. It's not the actual registration process. So when I'm trying to find more details, I'll ask those follow-up questions. And there's always a point that you get when you're asking where it's like you've exhausted everything. You're like, well, there's really no more, nothing else I can follow up with. So that's when I'll move on to the next question. So, I'll have like these intentional pauses in there, or ask them to think or reflect on something. And that'll give me more information about that topic.
Yeah. So thank you. So then as we then look at focus groups, can you talk about then some of the benefits and as well as some of the challenges?
Oh, sure. Benefits is that time, right? So it's efficient in terms of data collection. So rather than having, 10 1-hour interviews, I can get them all into one room and do maybe an hour or hour and a half, right? Depending on what I want to know. You get diverse perspectives, right? So you have this mix of people from, different age ranges, experience ranges. It's a definitely different dynamic, right? You have these interactions, so interactive environment where you have them playing off of each other, which is really interesting. So you're moderating, but you're more facilitating than you are moderating. It's a different dynamic. And then you get to really see these nonverbal cues, right? So if someone says something and it may not resonate with someone else and you see it in their face, you can ask those types of follow-up questions. So it makes for a different dynamic, which I just find fascinating. The challenges, though, you have that dominant, person or persons, right, that you have to be able to manage gently, right, so that you can get all representation, right? So you want to hear from everyone, but then you have some really shy people or passive participants that you have to really try to draw them in, right? Bring them in and let them feel that this environment is safe enough for everyone to share their perspective. But then that leads into that social desirability bias, right? So if you have one participant that's like, I was not feeling this at all, and everybody else is like, no, we think this is great, they may be more likely to say, yeah, okay, it's good, it's okay, right? You may not get the response, right? You have limited generalizability, right? Because if you only have 8 to 12, that you can't generalize that to a population, right? So you really can't do that. And then if you are not a skilled moderator, it can be 1 hour of a nightmare, right? So you have to be able to manage people and listen carefully and be, really on your toes in that focus group, because there's a lot of moving pieces in there that you have to navigate.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what have you found within your work? What are some of the key skills
Mm.
that are required to conduct focus groups and interviews that yield the information and insights that are needed?
I would say the first is active listening.
Mm-hmm.
I've always said that listening is a skill. If you are really intently listening to someone, it's work, right?
Right.
It's not
Right.
just I'm waiting for them to finish so I can jump in. You have to really listen and extract key, phrases, points. You have to be really skilled in that. You have to be able to guide conversations to ensure that everyone has their views expressed.
Mm-hmm.
You have to balance that participation. You have to balance the flow. So if you have to say, okay, we're going to do a round robin, everybody gets a chance to say, you might have to switch up and be
Right.
flexible and adaptable. Time management, right? So you have
Mm-hmm.
to think about how much time you have with these participants, and that you're able to get the key insights that you need, but also have time to probe for deeper conversation. So you have
Yeah.
to balance that. You have to be adaptable, flexible, and you have to have empathy,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I would say those are the key skills.
Well, and even as we even kind of talk a little bit about coming up with questions
Mhm.
for specific stakeholder groups, even having the skill of cultural competence, or
Yes.
having those to be able to even know when to ask additional questions, desegregate certain data, and even know how to go about asking particular questions, not to offend a particular group. So can you even
Right.
maybe talk a little bit about how you go about tailoring inquiries for particular stakeholder groups as you disaggregate data?
Right. So cultural sensitivity is a big one, right? So you have to demonstrate an understanding of each stakeholder's language, right? So what are their priorities? What are their communication styles? What are their needs? Like, you have to really be intentional so that you are being culturally sensitive. And then you also have to think about like how questions may differ when you're targeting different groups. Right. So you can't use the same type of questioning for all groups, or you're going to lose them. And this might, I don't know, I hope this example works, but like, we deal with people who buy our software as well as people that use our software. They're two different users.
Right,
I
right.
have to be mindful that I'm not asking questions of this user that would, relate to a buyer, because I'm going to miss the mark, and vice
Right.
versa. So
Mhm.
think about that in terms of like just cultural sensitivity. That's just like the buyer user is a simple example, but if you're thinking like cross culturally, you have to be sensitive to who your users are.
Right. And I can see that there will probably even be some either some technique or some skill needed to be able to be agile
Oh yeah.
and be able to be responsiveness to come up with questions on the fly as new information comes up. So can you talk about the importance of that, having that ability, that skill set to then be able to again get all the information and insights, as you mentioned, as you have a warm body
Mhm.
or warm bodies in front of you?
Yeah, I mean, if you're too rigid, you're going to miss an opportunity. And I know it's hard as researchers, right? We're so type A. We have our script down, we've rehearsed it, we've practiced it. Okay, I'm going to ask these questions in this way. But you have to be able to adapt and, like, ask questions on the fly. You have to be able to do that, because what it does is it helps us gain like these real time insights
Mhm.
that we would not have gotten if we just stuck to the script. So that's why it's always good. Like, even I'm not saying don't go in without a script. I'm not saying that. I always have a script,
Right.
but I will leave room to say, okay, wait, you said something that was really interesting. Or one thing I've done a lot is, especially like with usability testing, like I'll share a prototype. I'll say, here's some tasks we're going to do. And I'll show it and I'll say, for example, I want you, before you start clicking, I want you to take a look around and just tell me what you're thinking. And if they say they may never say anything. They may have a facial expression, or they'll go, "Hmm." I'll say, "Wait, I heard you say, hmm. Tell me a little bit more
What
about
I mean?
that reaction." Right? So if I'm just reading my script and I'm just thinking about that, and I'm not even engaging, I might miss that. So you
Right.
have to be able to make those shifts really, really quickly. Um, I'll say, like for example, like we just launched a new product, and the initial set of questions were designed, to identify usability. But during the interview, I noticed this recurring theme that keeps coming up about a specific feature. But I may not even have thought about that in my script. I want to ask about that because that's a
Right.
recurring theme. So I have to be able to be nimble enough to go to that and be able to bring them back so I can get back on task and on script.
Yeah, and especially it's even as you're talking, being able to be open, right? To be able to get additional information, but to know this is something that I may have to come back to. I know we were working with the client to where we're working with their sales teams, and we
Mhm.
had disaggregate them by different groups of those who were exceeding their sales goals, those who were meeting them, and those who were not meeting their sales goals. And as we really talk to and have focus groups within each group, we were then really like trying to figure out, okay, what is the characteristics that differs between these particular groups as well as their sales performance. And
Mhm.
I can even just think about how we would have to go back and forth because we were, of course, listening to certain things, but we didn't know what we were listening for.
Right.
So then being able to be open up when that particular thing comes, how do we then bring it back to recall, okay, this is something that we need to explore maybe at a later date, or maybe
Mhm.
we need to go at it right now. So I
Right.
appreciate you sharing those examples of ways in which to be agile, to be responsive. So I
Mhm.
want to also then ask, as people are doing interviews and they're doing focus groups, are there some practical tips, some best practices that one should adhere to?
Sure. One is make sure you have a clearly defined goal or objective, right? Because then that's going to help guide the conversation.
Mhm.
Prepare, right? Preparation is key, and make sure you know your topic. Test any technology in advance. 'Cause, I mean, we all know, right?
Right.
Make sure that you're building rapport. That's going to be really important, like building this comfortable space, because you want your participants to be able to share their feelings and expectations openly and their thoughts openly. That's going to be really important. I said this before, active listening, like fully concentrate, understand, and respond to their comments. Don't just like let that go. Like if
Mhm.
they're making a comment, make sure that you are acknowledging what they say, because it fosters engagement. That's
Right.
that's going to be key. Use different question formats, right? Again, not all open ended, not all close ended, right? If you're like a new researcher in this space, think about like how you can become a more effective facilitator and moderator, right? So you can't like interject your own personal opinions, and that's not easy to do,
Right.
right? It's hard to do. So it requires skill, but you have to be really careful about that. So you have to be able to engage, but not overdo or overshare your own personal opinions and biases. Pay attention to those nonverbal cues. They are there, especially in a focus group. They're there even on one-on-ones, but certainly in a focus group, you'll want to be observant and watch the group dynamic. This one thing that I love, I would say, use silence strategically.
Mm.
I love awkward pauses. I,
Yeah.
I know people hate. I know people hate it. Like the Zoom call when you get on and everybody's like,
What we gonna
"Hmm."
say? What do we
I
do?
love it. I love it.
Mhm.
But I think it gives time for reflection, right? And then when people are in that silent space, they're thinking. And so
Right.
when you give them that space, and I say after a few beats, right, tell me what you're thinking. I'm going to get something much deeper than I would if we were just talking, without a break, right? So use
Absolutely.
silence strategically. Yeah.
Mm. And are there any pitfalls that you
Mm.
would recommend Avoid it.
Yeah. Yes. It's like overlooking participants, like if you're noticing that lack of engagement, where you don't want to lose them, right? So lack of participant engagement, that's going to be one. Leading questions, like,
Yeah.
or inserting your own biases in there, that's a no-no. Letting those dominant voices or participants overrun the whole session, that's not going to be good. It's basically like the opposites of like those best practices. Like if you're not prepared, or if you're not paying attention, if you're zoning out when someone's talking and you're not catching what they're saying, that's going to be problematic. Or if you just like don't follow up with those follow-up questions or those probing questions, and look, all of these lead to those missed opportunities that we're trying to avoid.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, that is for one, that's great. I appreciate those responses. And we did end up receiving some questions from our form that we saved towards the end, that we wanted to be able to not only maybe go through some of these questions. So even if you're on and we may have a few minutes left. So if you do have some questions that you would like to ask Dr. Oliver and myself, please don't hesitate to send those in. So the first question we have, Dr. Oliver, that was sent in, and I'll just read it verbatim.
Okay.
One thing I would like to hear about is how to skillfully keep everyone on track during the interview focus group while still allowing space for them to think outside of the box in their answers. Additionally, this question, how important is the why for those participating? For example, why this focus group matters, why you or the organization are doing this focus group, etc. Do you believe that when those participating understand the why, that you get better results?
Oh, wow. That's a great
That's
question.
good. That's good.
That's a good one. Okay. So let me start with the first one, like keeping people on track, because I just had to like giggle a little bit there. So you have to strike this balance between keeping the discussion focused as well as allowing for creative thinking.
Mm-hmm.
So I was like typically like clearly outline the objective of our session, with like key topics, but also express openness to like hearing their perspectives. So it's really about like those moderation skills and those techniques. So if they get off track, right, if they're super, super creative and they're just like really going out there, you have to try to think of a way to gently steer them back. So I give them space though. I give them space to talk and say whatever. And sometimes I go off track and I'll say, wow, that was really interesting. Let me make a note of that because I don't want to forget that. And I want to be able to get back to that. Right. So, I'll do it. Like I'll make a note and then say, okay, that was really insightful. And I want to talk a little bit about that more, but wow, I don't want to lose my train of thought. Right. So I'll put it on me and then we'll get through the rest of it. And I'll come back to it and say, okay, tell me a little bit more about that. And then that, that gets them really engaged. If you have someone that's too rigid, right, I'll encourage them to dream. I'll say like, okay, well, dream for me. If you had a product that was able to do all of the things that you were talking about, what would it look like? Take a moment to dream. And then I'll give them a few, like I won't say anything. And I'll let them think
awkward silence.
That awkward pause, right? But they're like thinking like, wow, I haven't dream. Well, yeah, and sometimes I hear them get flustered, like, what? Dream? I don't do that. And I'm like, well, no, tell me, I know one time I did, and this is attributed to my supervisor, Bobby Gonzalez. Right. He said one time, to me, he's like, you remember the movie Minority Report? And I was like, yeah, Tom Cruise, right? He had like the things on the screen. And he's like, yeah, we should ask our participants, like, if they could create something, what would it look like on a dashboard or on their screen? I was like, oh, I'm taking that. So I did that. And it worked. It worked. I was like, okay, dream for me. And it was like a couple of participants and they were like, I don't know what you're talking about. And I was like, did you see the movie? And they were like, yeah, I saw it. I was like, I use this like moving things on the screen. If you had a layout that you needed to create to do your job effectively, what would you put on that screen? It just opened everything up. And I was like, oh, this is brilliant. So just giving them space to do that, you can get insight. And if you have a dreamer, you can always say, oh, that's brilliant. That's fascinating. I want to get back to that. I want to save time at the end. How's 10 minutes to talk about that at the end? And you'll get that engagement from there too. The second question was about the why, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So I think that you get better results when you talk about the why. I'm very open about what we intend to do because people are more likely to engage and actively provide like these thoughtful, responses. So I think it's just like transparency. It builds
Mm-hmm.
trust. It gives context, right? So I'll say, hey, the purpose, I'm trying to learn from you. Like my goal is to learn as much as I can about you and your process. I'm not here to judge. Yeah, there are no, wrong answers here. If I'm doing like an interview in conjunction with a test, I think that users get very nervous about that because they feel like, okay, I'm going to do something wrong. Like, I'm like, there's no wrong answers here. And I didn't design this, so you're not going to hurt my feelings. I want an open and honest response. And then that gets them like, oh,
Mm-hmm.
okay. So I think knowing the why is important. Now, I'm going to shift it a little bit. If I'm doing just strictly usability testing, right? Like, how many clicks does it take for you to do this? How much time does it take? I'll say something like you're going to interact with a prototype. I'll give them the overarching goal, but I won't tell them if they made a mistake like until the end because I don't want to disrupt their process. But
Mm-hmm.
that's totally different. If we're going to talk about usability testing, that's another.
Well, and I was going to ask, can you maybe just give, for those who may be unfamiliar, maybe just a brief definition of what usability testing is?
Okay, so usability testing is I want to know how efficient, how effective, and how satisfied a participant is with our product, right? So I'm going to test I'm going to give them a certain number of tasks that I want them to complete. Now I might prompt what the task is, like, okay, I want you to buy an airline ticket, for example, and then I want to see where they go to buy that ticket, how many clicks it took them to get there, how much time it took them to get there, did they pass, did they fail, and then their level of ease, right? So how easy or difficult was it for you to complete this task? So I actually will have quantifiable data, right?
Yeah.
Usually larger sample sizes that we can generalize, you really can't generalize when you have 30 people, but still, in theory, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I'm not necessarily doing that interview style, although I usually will ask questions at the end to probe a little bit more, but it's usually very, this is what we're doing. These are tasks. I want to know, and then we can move on to the next participant. With the company Andalusian, we do like a mix because we really do value those mixed methods where, I am doing usability testing, but I'm also asking those probing questions.
Right.
So it's a healthy mix of like the close-ended, like quantifiable numbers, tasks, and open-ended questions because I only have them there for that time that I have them.
Right, right. And I want to ask, and I think this is maybe what the question was getting at on another level of how I think the why is for the particular person who is on the other end of that focus group. So do they need to have some stake in the game, or do they need to, in order to get better? Have you found that you've gotten better results or better insights if they have a why connected to why they're there?
Absolutely. Because again, it builds trust. And they'll have context so they know the purpose of why they're there, right? So it's like, I'm trying to get information from you. I'm trying to learn. We have these products here, or we have this service here. I want to learn from you. That's why we're here, right? So I'll definitely think it's important to be able to disclose the why. If you think about it, like, as researchers, we want to know the why. Right. If someone were to interview us or survey us on something, we would want to know, what is this for? What's the purpose of this? Right. Why am I investing my time in this? So I think that, for engagement purposes, it's definitely important to have the why.
Perfect. Thank you. One of the other questions that we ended up getting in, what questions should be asked in order to identify the quality of follow-through, specifically in remote-only roles? For example, what kinds of questions can you ask to identify how reliable a potential employee will be to follow through on the duties they're interviewing for.
Oh, okay. So this is like an employer wanting to know how to
Correct.
strategically.
Yes,
Okay.
ma'am. Yes, ma'am. That's right.
Okay. Okay. So I would probably ask, can you provide a few examples of projects where you successfully completed while working remotely at your previous role?
Mhm.
Right. Um, how did you ensure that this task was completed on time? Um, how did you hold yourself accountable for deadlines without direct in-person supervision?
Yeah,
Right.
yep.
Um, strategic questioning is more like describe a scenario where you had to communicate a delay or a change in schedule or meeting a deadline. How did you handle it? How did you follow up? Like those
Mhm.
types of questions.
Yeah, and
Um,
I think one thing too that could also be helpful is asking them their preference on the duration of projects they like to work on. And from being able to, whether they're long term, a year, 6 months, or
yes.
shorter term, that'll then at least provide some information or insights to ask additional questions on, to even see if this is a person who would be right for this role just based on their preference of the projects they like to work on.
That's a really good point too. And the like piggyback on that too, like whatever that scope of that project would be or the length of time, I would create a scenario for them,
Mhm.
right? And then say like, how would you tackle that within that time frame that you specified? Right. So if they were like, oh, I'm really good with short-term okay, well, here's a scenario of a short-term project. Like, how would you tackle that? Right.
Exactly.
And then see what their thought processes, are. You'll get a really good view of if they're reliable, especially when if they have to meet certain deadlines, or checkpoints along the way.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yep. We got another one that came in. Um, how can I learn to best service my customers by gaining from them an accurate idea of their needs, goals, and aspirations as an organization? Being able to get into their heart of their needs through effective asking the right questions.
Okay. What I typically do, because again, I'm really trying to identify those same things: goals,
Mhm.
aspirations, pain points. So, depending on what your project is, I can only speak for what I do. So I'll bring someone in and I'll say something like, okay, I don't act like you're training me on your job, right?
Mm,
Because I don't, I may not know your process. So again, I'll do the buckets, like tell me from start, middle, end, right? Give me an overview of what you do. And then I'll say, okay, well, what works well in your process, right? And then I'll go into what doesn't work well in your process.
yeah.
And so then I'm able to identify like the things that work well, right? These are like, hey, these goals have been met. Like my aspirational goals have been met in this space. What doesn't work well, like these are those unmet needs. So
Mhm.
then I can like zero in and say, okay, well, tell me more about those unmet needs. Again, this doesn't even have to be our product. It can be any product that they're using that we might want to compete. And then I'll say, okay, well, if you had to hire a product to address that need, what would it do?
Mm,
How would it do that?
mhm.
And then they can go, oh, well, right. And then they start thinking about what those solutions might look like, what would work best for them. Then I start getting to like that heart, right? I get into like,
Yeah.
I can zero in on this would make this person's job easier. If we could create something that did that, we're going to win.
Uh,
Or even if it's a service or if it's higher ed, right? We're hearing students say this, right, about this area of our institution. If we can target that, we could increase enrollment, or we can, you can make
mhm.
those decisions based on, the data that you receive. I
Yeah.
hope that answered the question. So,
Yeah, and I really like that, and I'm gonna have to take that one. The one the one you just talked about is how would you go about doing this? So I thought that was a really really good. Good question. Another one that we have is when handling an in-house focus group with professionals from various hierarchies,
Mhm.
how can we manage overly assertive senior leaders? Additionally, are there best practices for ensuring all levels of the hierarchy are fully engaged?
Mm, okay. So this was at my previous company. We had a focus group, and it probably, I think we were at the max, we were at like 12 people. Um, and they were from all over, different different backgrounds,
Mhm.
different companies even. And we had two that were very dominant and had a lot to say. So one thing that I did say was like, okay, well, we have observers, right, that are behind me. They're, it's like a two-way mirror. We have some observers and they're taking down some notes, right? So I'm gonna, pop back and get those notes and ask some questions. So I would go back, get some sticky notes, come back into the room and say to the shy one, right?
Mhm.
Let me ask you a question specifically. There was a question that came for you, right? Because you mentioned such and such. So it shifts the attention,
Mhm.
right? And okay, what did you think about that? Okay, I'm gonna ask one more. I'm gonna take two more comments, and then we'll move on. So you have to be really, you have to juggle. Um,
Yeah.
those dominant people, they're not gonna be offended if you do that. If you like take that moment, okay, I'm gonna come back because they've said what they had to say. They're
Right.
fine. they're they're gonna be who they are anyway. They're just like that. But it's a good way to balance it out by bringing other people into the conversation. Um, Sometimes if I'm talking with somebody that does have that dominant personality and I let them get out what they need to get out within the time that I need them to get it, right? I can say, "Oh, tell me what you thought about what Joe said." Right? So I'll go
Mhm.
to that person to try to draw them in, and
Yeah.
they can respond and then have that kind of conversation. So it does require a lot of skill. Again, it requires that like active listening, note taking, and you may not be the one that takes the notes. Make sure you have somebody that can take those notes for you,
Mhm.
because if you're taking notes and you're gonna miss something. So
Right.
that's a good way to kind of draw certain people out, because you don't want to shut down the
Right.
talkative folks. You definitely don't want to do that, but you have to be able to divert and
Yeah. Yeah. But I think that's good, especially for someone who's continuously talking. Asking somebody who's quiet what they think about the person who's talking a lot, what they said, to then be able to switch. And this will be our last question because we're coming up on time. And this is, I believe, a short one. How can we encourage the new generation of students to use strategic questioning in their learning?
Mhm, mhm. I think we have to model it ourselves. So if you are faculty, staff, right, we need to incorporate it into whatever our practices are. I'm really going to speak, I guess, as the faculty side because I had been faculty once upon a time, but modeling it in our own teaching practices, like pose these thought-provoking questions during lectures or interactions, or if you're an advisor, ask those types of thought-provoking questions. So you're modeling it first,
Mhm.
and then making sure that you're creating an environment, whether it's a meeting environment, a classroom environment, that values and celebrates curiosity. Because I think that's the big thing, right? As researchers, we are curious by nature, so we ask a lot of questions, but that's because we feel that we're in a safe space to do that. So we want to
Right.
create an environment for students to feel that level of safety. Like there are no wrong questions, right? So ask whatever you need to ask. If students are doing like group work, and I know students hate group work, I know it, right? But like it does help promote like critical thinking.
Mhm.
So that encourages that. We won't talk about like the grading sign and stuff like that, but that collaboration, it
Mhm.
requires strategic questioning to answer a prompt or to answer a question. So I think that if we celebrate that, then there'll be more students will be more likely to do it.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, we are on time, Dr. Oliver. We sincerely appreciate you coming on and sharing your insights,
Thank
going in
you.
depth about the work that you're doing over at Illusioning, your previous experiences. your PhD work. We really appreciate it. And if anyone has any questions about the work that the Locus Group is doing, or if you see any ways that we can collaborate or partner, we'd love to be able to talk to you. So we hope everyone has a wonderful evening, a good night, and we will see you soon. Bye-bye.
Thanks again.